Darkest Dungeon is about making the most of a bad situation. Quests will fail or must be abandoned. Heroes will die. And when they die, they stay dead. Progress autosaves constantly, so actions are permanent. After the intro cinematic, this is the first thing you read when opening Darkest Dungeon. This is a use of Rhetoric. In school, you may have heard of Logos, Pathos, and Ethos. And like me, you probably initially brushed it off as another overcomplication of writing that made the process tedious and boring. However, Rhetoric is used in our everyday lives, including in the games we play. But what is Rhetoric? Essentially, Rhetoric is the art of persuasion in writing. When writers want to convince their readers of something, they use Rhetoric. Most commonly, it comes in four forms known as the rhetorical appeals that all work together in an attempt to persuade a reader of the author's ideas. These forms are Ethos, Kairos, Pathos, and Logos. But who am I to talk about the use of rhetoric in games? Well, I've been developing games off and on since 2015, and I have played games for as long as I can remember. I'm also a college student who is currently studying the rhetorical appeals as part of my coursework. What I did there was an example of Ethos, establishing credibility and giving your audience a reason to pay attention to you. You wouldn't let a capybara teach you astrophysics, would you? Well, maybe they have some secret forbidden knowledge that we don't know about, but we could never know since they never use Ethos to establish their credibility. In video games, this can be done in several different ways. Firstly, a developer could convince someone to play their game by simply establishing their credibility. If a developer made a good game previously and mentions its reviews and sales numbers when trying to sell it, that in itself is a form of ethos. Their credibility is established by proving that they already know how to make a game well, and it convinces others to play their new game. This happens a lot and is probably the most common form of ethos within game development. It's how, for the most part, Call of Duty and Pokemon sell their games every year. The formula often doesn't change very much with these games, and they may even ship with several bugs or glitches. But because of the fanbase's love of the previous games, they buy it and play it anyway, even if they have issues. Alternatively, characters in video games can use ethos, making you want to do their quests or interact more with them. For instance, going back to the Pokemon example, in their newest game, Scarlet and Violet, there are 3 different quests to take on. Each stars a different character that each use rhetorical appeals to motivate you to do their quest. The one you meet first, Nimona, uses ethos. Firstly, she is champion ranked, meaning she's beaten all 8 gyms as well as completed the champion assessment. She wants you to be her rival and complete the champion assessment as well. Because of her status, we are motivated to complete the assessment and surpass her. Ethos can be very important to motivate players to buy, play, or continue playing a game, whether it be in the form of establishing the developer's ethos or a character's ethos. So why did I bring up that quote from Darkest Dungeon at the beginning of the video? Well, this was actually a display of Kairos. Kairos is the rhetorical appeal that deals with timing. Often this refers to the time and situation that the piece is released. However, in this situation, the quote is given at the beginning of the game, before the player has played the game, but after they've watched the intro cutscene. If it was shown before the cutscene, it may have scared players off since they wouldn't want to play a hard game that they had no interest or stakes in. However, since the intro cutscene has already played, the player is drawn in by the mystery, art style, voice acting, and everything else the intro cutscene provides before being given the warning. This has the effect of players being willing to give the game a try, despite its difficulty, while providing a fair warning, ensuring that people who want to play the game will be those who expect and like a challenge. For a more traditional example, Celeste is a game about Madeline, a girl going through some mental health issues, climbing a mountain symbolic of her inner struggles. The game's writer, Maddie Thorson, was struggling with her personal and gender identity at the time, as were several lovers of the game. The game came out in 2018, at a time when mental health and being trans were being talked about more. The game is, in general, about mental health and struggling with one's identity. Throughout the game, Madeline is struggling with self-loathing, anxiety attacks, and more. Heck, a shadow version of herself comes out of a mirror and starts chasing her, telling her that she will never overcome this mountain. If that's not symbolic, then I don't know what is. Mental health and the struggle for identity, especially that of gender identity, have been ongoing issues, ones especially prevalent today. Maddie Thorson and the rest of the team that worked on Celeste brought to light these issues using Kairos by making the game about issues prevalent at the time that really resonated with players. In fact, it was so successful that Celeste won an award for the Games for Impact category of the Game Awards. Aside from that though, Celeste has won several other awards. It's one of the most influential games released in recent times with a cult following. Kairos is essential to make players start or finish playing games. In terms of Darkest Dungeon, mentioning the warning too early scares people off, and too late makes players feel like they've wasted their time. On top of using it within games, game developers taking into account the social issues prevalent make the games that they develop more relatable to their audience, like in the case of Celeste. Pathos is the appeal to emotions. It's what writers use to convince people through their feelings. This is where anecdotes about sick family members, quotes that make you think, and jokes that make you laugh come to shine. Since it's been my life recently, bringing up Pokemon Scarlet and Violet again, Arven's quest is chock full of pathos. His whole questline is about nursing his sick dog back to health. Many players can relate to him since we all grow heavily attached to our pets. In addition, Arven's story involves his absent parents and his struggles with them. These situations appeal to the player's sense of sympathy and sadness, making them want to nurse the dog back to health as quickly as possible. In fact, I know of several people who have skipped everything else until my boss stiff was back to full health. For another example, we can look at my game, Fell, which is on Steam by the way. These rhetorical devices can be used without words in multiple different ways. Firstly, the intrinsic joy that players feel when they play a game, look at its art, or beat a level is a form of pathos all in itself. In Fell, I exemplify this by using satisfying art, sound effects, music, and gameplay. Consistent and aesthetically pleasing art, punchy sound effects, mood-appropriate music, and polished gameplay mechanics are all things that make the player enjoy the game that they're playing. In terms of making these games' mechanics better, the more polished feedback a player gets when they perform an action, the more fun they have. For example, I use particle effects in conjunction with sound effects to achieve a weighty and responsive feeling in Fell. Using Pathos is one of, if not the most important rhetorical devices when it comes to video games for this reason. Video games are a form of art, and as such, most players come in looking for appeals to their emotions. Though one could argue that strategy games and the like more appeal to Logos is the appeal to the audience's rationale. Using facts, logic, and evidence are tenets of Logos. This is where statistics, studies, experience, and the like are used to persuade an audience. In Sid Meier's Civilization 6, you take control of a nation and develop it. In order to win, you could crush all other nations, or alternatively, you could surpass them in science, culture, religion, or diplomacy. While for most first-time players, domination is the most obvious win condition, these other options for victory convince players to interact with different parts of the game and build a different civilization each time. Because of this, people replay the game over and over and over again, using new strategies and win conditions while playing the same game. Additionally, the game asks the player to make logical decisions about what's best for the nation that they're building. This heavily applies to the logical parts of our brains, and if you're anything like me who loves to solve virtual problems, you get hooked on doing so. This ties into the game's argument about the real world as well. The game has these different win conditions to say something about the world and politics. It shows that military might is not the only path to a successful nation, and peaceful solutions are just as good, if not better, than violent ones, depending on the situation. Pieces of text can, and often do, use multiple rhetorical appeals at the same time. For instance, the Darkest Dungeon example mentioned previously for Kairos also uses logos to illustrate the game's point. Heroes will die. This is a statement of facts. The purpose of it is to ensure that players don't get too demotivated when their favorite heroes inevitably die. It tells the player exactly what to expect in the game and convinces players to keep going when a hero dies. The game also directly mentions why this should not disappoint them later in the screen's text. Thankfully, there are always fresh souls arriving on the stagecoach, seeking both adventure and fame. This tells players that there are always more chances, and each hero that dies will not be the last they get to use. Games use rhetoric all the time to convince players to buy, enjoy, keep playing, and or play a game a certain way. Ethos is the appeal to one's character and credibility. It's used in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet as a way to convince the player to compete in Emona's questline. It's also used to convince the audience to buy games from already known companies, like in the case of Pokemon and Call of Duty. Kairos is the appeal to the timeliness of your argument. It's used in Darkest Dungeon to set expectations for the game early, and it's used in Celeste by having the game be about the culturally relevant topic of identity and mental health. Pathos is the appeal to one's emotions. It's used in Scarlet and Violet by Arven's relatable, tragic, and motivating backstory. It's used in countless other games, including my own Fell, in the form of fun gameplay and mechanics, visually pleasing art, polish, and more. Lastly, Logos is the appeal to an audience's rationale. It's used in Civ 6 by having the player make logical decisions to win, which mirrors the game's argument about the strategic and complex nature of politics in the real world. It's used in Darkest Dungeon by setting expectations for the game, convincing players to stick with the game even when they are encountered with an experience that they otherwise may not expect and find frustrating. Rhetoric can be used in many different ways and situations, especially in video games. If you're a developer, then I hope you found this video helpful for using rhetoric in your own games. If you're a student learning rhetoric, then I hope I related the topic to something that you enjoy. Bye!